Hi everyone, welcome to the legal discussion about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on human rights. As we all know, we know there have been several occasions where human rights were violated during the pandemic. Before we start the discussion, there are a few things that need to be mentioned. Remember to turn off your microphones to prevent any disturbances, and there will be two sessions. The first session will be conducted by the speaker till 7:30, and the second one will be a questions and answers session. And during that, if you want to ask questions, you can unmute your speaker and ask directly, or you can send it in the group chat so then I can forward it to the speaker. Also, just a quick reminder, Zoom calls usually last for 40 minutes. So I'll send the link for the next session in the group chat and all of you can join. Moving on to our speaker today, Ms. Danushka Madhavatta, a senior lecturer of International Humanitarian Law, Constitutional Law and Human Rights Law at the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo. She received her LLB with honors and LLM from the University of Colombo. She also received a LLM from the Harvard Law School. Ms. Danushka, it's our honor to have you here today, and without further ado, I would like to invite you to proceed with the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denity. We have a very little time, so I thought of sort of basically highlighting what are the human rights issues that have arisen at this particular point of time, and some issues which are considered extremely problematic at the moment. We will be able to go into a little bit of detail, and I'll be very happy to forward any other reading or other material that you can look at if you're interested in looking at additional material than what we're covering today. So in terms of what I'm going to cover in this public address, first I will lay down some of the core human rights issues that have arisen with the COVID-19 pandemic, which are affecting not only the Sri Lankan context, but the global context. So these human rights issues have been written on. And if you're interested in looking up some of the global addresses and analysis, you can take a look at the European Journal of International Law, EJIL Talk, which is a blog which has very concise, precise analysis of some of these issues. And I'm then going to talk about the concept paper that was issued by the government of Sri Lanka regarding how it is planning to address the COVID-19 pandemic within the country and the associated issues. I'm also going to talk about something called the hammer and dance approach that was used by the state and which is being used by other states as well. In relation to the hammer and dance approach, we are going to talk about the restriction of human rights and whether it is possible. If it is possible, how we do it. And the obvious question that arose at the beginning was, is there a possibility to impose a curfew under the quarantine laws when the quarantine laws don't really mention the possibility of doing so? Why not use the emergency regulations under the public security ordinance? How does rule of law come into being in all of this? How is the constitution affected, if at all? And how is the dissolution of parliament impacting? And is there an impact on human rights because the parliament is not in session? So these are some of the main issues that arose. In terms of human rights and the core human rights related issues that arose in Sri Lanka specifically, one of the first issues that we started looking at was the frontline workers and first responders, which would be the medical personnel as well as the police personnel and PHIs who were involved in tracing the people who got infected, and then obviously how the healthcare facilities in Sri Lanka was handling this. So health and safety of the healthcare and frontline workers was a major issue. Now, as you very well know, the Navy has a big cluster of infections, and the main allegation was that the Navy didn't have enough personal protection equipment, and whether this in itself is human rights violation is something that we need to think of. So that's the first issue, health and safety rights of healthcare and other frontline workers. Secondly, we need to also think of the involvement and the scale of involvement of the police and military personnel. So this is a health crisis. And why do we see in not only Sri Lanka, but in most of the countries, the involvement of police and military personnel. This is the same with regard to Spain as well. This is the same that with regard to Italy as well. But in Italy, this started happening much later, and you see that there was a lot of crisis in Italy. So we need to understand when the police and the military gets involved, there are different sets of laws that would apply, and sometimes it becomes a further crisis because the clarity between what part of health would be handled by them and what part of security related issues would be handled by them. Thirdly, there is an issue about democracy in general, locally as well as globally. So there has been a lot of conversation about whether human rights in the global sense, democracy in the global sense, whether it would have to be restructured in a post COVID-19 kind of situation. So there are several instances in history where human rights was rethought and reconstructed. So some are basically preparing themselves to see that human rights now after COVID-19 would also be different. So let me give a few examples. Cold War, okay, had a major impact on how human rights was perceived after that. Then we had one of the major issues in history, 9/11 attack on the US, which also made a major impact on how we see human rights today. And obviously, post COVID-19, the way that we see the world, the way that we see democracy, the way that we see our own rights as regards our ability to go out, hang out with people, do our daily activities would be very different from probably at least for another 1 year or maybe 5 years, as long as this disease lasts, for instance. So there is an implication for local and global democracy there. And fourthly, there are also issues arising about whether the capitalist structure that we are used to currently in the world has failed to provide for health, to provide for low income people, okay, and whether this capitalist approach has created a situation where we are suppressing individual liberal choices now, okay, whether that suppression is directly associated with the failure of capitalism is something that we need to look at. Fifthly, you might remember right after the state went into a complete lockdown and where people were confused as to how you're going to buy your food, how you're going to get your general supplies, a lot of online structures arose. And with the online structures, a lot of other associated issues like theft and overcharging, a lot of other issues of that nature arose. So we know that those allegations also were leveled against some of the very prominent commercial entities, okay? So there is a violation of consumer rights as well. So you can take a look at the Consumer Affairs Authority for that. There is a set of laws separately in that respect as well. Sixth issue is that the implication of free healthcare versus healthcare insurance schemes and healthcare that is offered by the private sector. So in the context of Sri Lanka, we saw that the handling of the pandemic was entirely rested on the public healthcare system. This is the case with regard to countries where there is a public healthcare system which doesn't charge, and this is not something that is very spread out in the world. Public healthcare, which is completely free, is not something that is common. Even in structures where you have extremely extreme reliance on private healthcare facilities in some countries, there was a move for the state to take these private healthcare facilities under their wing, under the wing of the state. So to pretty much make it something public, something national that everyone can use, irrespective of whether you have your insurance schemes or not. So in countries where there are private insurance schemes, which are extremely costly, people have the trouble of even being able to afford healthcare. Okay, so this is not an issue that arose in Sri Lanka, but that's something that we need to take into account, because we saw how at the very beginning, when the test was necessitated to be done from private institutions, they started charging a really high amount, and the state had to get involved at that point to make sure that the testing was done in public healthcare facilities. Okay. The seventh issue that we have had is with regard to people getting confined to homes. So if you have a home to get confined to during the lockdown, which is all very well and good, but whether that is good and is actually helping you protect your rights is dependent on whether you have a safe space as a home. In the global structure as well as in the local structure, we saw that there was a rise in the number of child abuse cases and domestic violence cases, especially against women. So intimate partner violence becomes one of the main issues that we need to take a look at in this crisis as a human rights impact that has arisen in connection with COVID-19. Then, as I said, your rights within a confinement happens if you have a home. What if you don't have a home and if you are a homeless person? Homeless persons' rights were affected. You must have seen on TV how these people were rounded up and the testing was done on them, which is very good. But then the handling of it by the media in a manner that these people's privacy was impeded on is a big problem in terms of how we look at human rights. Then there is also the offshoot of that. Even if you're not homeless, if you happen to be from a low income background, there are major issues in terms of not only finding your food, but also ensuring that your health and safety is safeguarded. There are also issues in relation to education. We know that right after the schools and universities went into closing, on-site teaching stopped, there was a move to doing the teaching on Zoom and Jitsi and other online providers like that. There are students who are unable to afford some such mechanism of that nature. So what happens with regard to equality of education and equity in access to education is something that is extremely problematic. In relation to this, of course, we also had the Vice Chancellor of the university speaking. In terms of my own faculty, the situation is somewhat good. From the survey that we have done, I think it was revealed that there was only around 27 students who didn't have access, and the university is trying to do something about it right now. But the issue is whether the state as a whole or the world as a whole is prepared to take on something of this magnitude, because COVID-19 and viruses that spread like this has been talked of for a very long time, but the world in general has failed to put in place hard and fast mechanisms to deal with this. So we also have the issue of education then stemming to unemployment as well. So even if you don't get unemployed, there is an issue of underemployment. Sometimes your salary might be deducted, sometimes you might lose the job entirely. And what happens with the labor market? How are you going to ensure that these people are provided for? In certain countries, there are social security mechanisms that provide for people who are unemployed. There is a small stipend or a particular benefit that is given out to people like this. But in Sri Lanka, we don't have the social security mechanism to cater to that particular aspect. So maybe it is the time for us to start thinking of those perspectives as well. And then we get to also another offshoot. We saw that there were some racist issues also coming up in the context of Sri Lanka as well as India and in many other countries. We also saw issues of xenophobic violence coming up in mostly white states, where Chinese or Chinese looking individuals were deliberately targeted by the rest of the population, saying, you all are the ones who brought this virus, therefore we need to be able to get rid of you kind of approach. And in the United States, of course, you saw that getting out of hand because the president of the United States started talking about the quote unquote Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus without calling it by its scientifically accepted name right now. So that is a global issue of calling it the Chinese virus. But in the local context, we saw that there were issues about different clusters of populations, our population spreading the virus. There was an allegation at one point that the Muslim population is spreading it. There were concerns about racism rising up in that situation. Then we saw how a particular cluster from the Navy contracted the virus. Then we saw that people were trying to respond to that also in the same way. So we try to sort of divide our groups into our community into different groups and say this particular group is violating, let's not give them rights, or let's adopt more stricter laws in relation to those populations. In India, of course, this also went further out of hand, and there were allegations that the hospitals weren't even taking some of the Muslim patients in. So there are issues of racism also coming up. But at the same time, we need to recognize that there are certain people in the community, not only in Sri Lanka, but everywhere else in the world as well, some who deliberately violate the protective mechanisms that have been put in place. These rules have been put in place to sort of safeguard us, and without trying to look at it only from the perspective of violating our liberal individual choices and autonomy. We need to be able to understand the larger narrative, which involves people's safety, the country's economy in general as well. So we need to see what human rights implications would arise if somebody, okay, for instance, me, if I decide not to wear a mask, if I decide to expose the others to the virus, how do you deal with a person like that? Does the law allow adopting some criminal measures against a person of that nature? Okay. So we found our first patient on the 27th of January 2020, and we had a domestic patient coming up on the 11th of March 2020. And within this interim, the government had already set in place a task force to look into this. There was a concept paper that was released in this regard, and the concept paper referred to something called the hammer and dance approach. This is an approach that has been adopted by other states as well, some other states. And you see in states where the hammer and dance approach has been adopted, there is some level of control of the spread of the virus. So what this theory says is that first you need to adopt extremely rigorous controls to prevent the disease from spreading in an uncontrollable manner. Spreading it to the community, what we call the community spread, can be prevented if you adopt the hammer approach. And the dance approach is you understand that the disease has the continuity for some time, and you want to ensure that you adopt safeguarding mechanisms for a longer time period. So what happens in the hammer approach is you bring in travel restrictions, you do contact tracing. So when the travel restrictions come up, we start saying there is a violation of our right to movement, because it is a right that is guaranteed by the Fundamental Rights chapter of Sri Lanka. Then when contact tracing happens, we start talking about the invasion of privacy. Okay. The contact tracing in itself is not a violation of the right, but how you go about it could become a violation of a right. So you saw in the past, we had certain media outlets going and visiting the people who were contracting the virus. Their homes were shown, their faces were shown without blurring it. Then it becomes a problem. So it's something to do with media guidelines, but it's also very difficult for the state to adopt measures to sort of curtail the rights of the media, because then it would become a totally different ballgame of human rights as the violation of freedom of speech and expression. Okay. So under the hammer approach, you have travel restrictions, contact tracing, then widespread testing, and the identification and isolation and care for those infected. So you go with a very rigorous kind of approach, and obviously there are some human rights that will get violated in the process. In the dance approach, you continue testing for the longer haul, and you isolate and quarantine. You keep on doing that as long as the disease is there. You focus on general hygiene and social distancing at a general level as well. and then you maintain bans on large gatherings, which you see happening in Sri Lanka, which is why even though we haven't gone for a community spread, the state has come out and said you can have the usual processions of the temples, the Peraharas, but you cannot have the crowd gathering for the Perahera. Okay, so as of now, we have had around 1,880 infected patients. When I checked last, it was 1,889 patients, 1,889 patients. We have had 11 deaths, and we have had around over 1,000 people who got cured, and we have done testing of over 85,000 patients, which is a good amount for a country like ours with a low GDP, so on and so forth. Okay, so in the concept paper that the government issued, there were 4 aspects that the government was looking at in terms of human rights as well. First one was military police intelligence line of operation, as in like detection, isolation, the tracing that happens under it. Then the second was looking at the medical and healthcare line of operation, where you get the doctors who are involved in epidemiology, the public health inspectors, the hospital chain involved. The third was looking at the psychological needs of the people, which is also a human rights need. So you look at right information, right to information happens to be a fundamental right within our constitutional framework as well. The government initially said that there was a confidence building approach coming in, as in everything will be informed to the public, and to ensure that the solidarity between the communities is also there. The fourth and the last one in that concept paper was looking at the economic and the community well-being by looking at supply of food, supply of medicine, maintenance of essential services without disruption, so on and so forth. Okay, so the idea is to achieve the end goal of stopping the spread of the virus altogether. So coming very quickly to whether there is a possibility to restrict rights in a situation like this, the rights that we claim are restricted in this current situation are all of the rights that are there in Article 14 of the Sri Lankan Constitution. Now, certain rights are inviolable at any point of time, irrespective of whether you're having an emergency situation or not, like right to be free from torture. But the rights that are there in Article 14 are subject to restrictions. Just because the Constitution says that you can restrict them, you cannot restrict these rights without informing the people how they're going to be restricted, what exactly are the restrictions, and what happens if you breach the restrictions that have been brought up. So there has to be a certain level of certainty. And in certain respects, in the Sri Lankan context, there were some lacunas in this regard. So if you take a look at Article 14, you will see that there is a statement there saying, no restriction shall be placed on these rights other than such restrictions prescribed by law as are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, it goes so on and so forth. So the issue that arose initially was, generally curfew that we are used to is coming from the course of emergency regulations, which is associated with the public security ordinance of the country. Under the public security ordinance of the country, the president can declare a state of emergency. And in those kind of situations, you look at national security, a threat of an armed conflict, a riot, insurgency, public security. Okay. The distinction here is that the quarantine related laws of Sri Lanka do not mention the word curfew. So the question was whether the curfew in itself is violative of the rights of the people. Okay. Generally, if you go by a very strict interpretation of what curfew is, you could say there is no mentioning of something called quarantine curfew in our law. So the curfew is invalid. But the question arises, can you bring up something like that, a lockdown procedure, because of the spread of the disease? Can you try to bring up a law like that in order to prevent the spread of the disease? Has been done in other countries as well, but I think the peculiar situation that we fell into is that we came into a situation where there is no parliament. Okay, so uh, the dissolution of the parliament in itself is not wrong, but the question was whether the parliament should be recalled in a situation like this. And you might also want to take a look at restrictions that are mentioned in Article 15, Sub-Article 7 of the Constitution, which say that some rights in Article 14 can be restricted. So this issue about whether the curfew is valid or not was also addressed in a case that was decided on the 11th of May 2020. This was in the Gampaha Magistrate Court. And what the magistrate seems to be saying is that curfew can be imposed generally under the Public Security Ordinance, but this is an exceptional situation. Therefore, this quarantine curfew is okay. So if you look at the purpose of the curfew, I think you can agree from a purposive approach, but of course there are arguments to the contrary, because if you go by an extremely technical approach, you can argue that there is nothing called quarantine curfew in the Sri Lankan law. So you might also want to take a look at the quarantine laws. You must remember that at one point when we were bringing down people from outside the country and when we started sending them to quarantine centers, an allegation arose that a certain amount of money was going to be charged from them, whether this is ethical or whether this is whether this is consistent with the rights approach. If you take a look at the quarantine laws, which is a law which is very, very old. This is Ordinance number 3 of 1897. Under that law, there is the possibility of charging a particular cost. Okay, so you can take a look at section 3, section 3D actually, which says you can establish and maintain quarantine stations, and to maintain the station and regulate it, manage it properly, you can recover a fee. But with the outcry that arose, the state decided not to charge any fee, even from the people who are occupying the spaces. But the law does allow for that. But I think it's a really good thing to safeguard the rights of the people, because most of the people have lost their jobs at this point. Even if you do have a job, if it's not something that you can do online, you cannot go and earn an income. So in those lines, even though the law allows to charge a particular amount, I think it's a really good thing that the state didn't do it. In terms of the isolation and putting them in quarantine, preventing them from going out, all of this is possible under the quarantine related laws in Sri Lanka. So there is no right violation that is happening there. Only thing you have to see is whether the people are taken in a manner that is dignified and respectful, that doesn't invade into their privacy in an unnecessary manner, that they're not exposed to the media in an unnecessary manner, because that would definitely end up becoming a violation of their rights. So as I mentioned earlier, if somebody is violating these health and safety protocols that have been put in place for our own protection, the Act also provides for that kind of situation, because the Act also lists what are the offenses under it and what do you do if somebody violates it. So there is also the possibility of even imposing a prison sentence after, of course, producing this person before a competent court. So you can't establish a new court. That would be a violation of rights. You can try to establish that a particular person has violated some of the laws and protocols in place, and then take that person into custody under the general laws available. That wouldn't be a violation of a human right. But you have to ensure that the arrest procedures are maintained. So these are some of the core issues that have arisen. Of course, there are issues about our privacy, our right to move about, whether democracy is being violated, whether the state has to ensure that the separation of powers, as in the separation between the executive, the president and the cabinet of ministers, the legislature, which is the parliament, then the judiciary, whether these three organs maintain the separation, because they have to be separate. And if you don't ensure that separation, there is also a problem of maintaining the law as the law. Okay, the law as the law, meaning Rule of law means that the law should be applied equally to the general public as well as everyone else. There is nobody above the law. So within the COVID-19 pandemic, it is not only a local issue, but it's an issue where the constitutional rights are also being violated across the world. But it's going to be a very difficult case to look at because of the nature of the pandemic that we are facing. So this is a very general overview of the rights issues that we are going through right now. I'll be very happy to take any questions or comments that you may have. Diniti, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. There were a few questions that someone has sent us privately. The first one is, as in India, hospitals rejecting to take patients because of their full patients. They say that there is also a violation of human rights, and what your opinion about it?
The Indian patients not being taken in.
Yeah, from the hospitals.
So, yeah, so the issue there is if they're racial profiling, then that's a big problem. The allegation that arose against the Indian hospital situation was that they're racially profiling and they're not admitting Muslim patients. If they're doing it for the lack of space, and if they're doing it across the board to everyone, I know it's not an acceptable situation, but there is nothing to do unless, of course, you set up a temporary hospital. But the violation here was that it was racially profiled.
And is there any action we could take for the violation of freedom of movement? Also, to which court can we present such cases?
Okay. So the court to which you will present it would be the Supreme Court, because you're talking about a fundamental rights issue. Every time it's a right to movement issue, it goes to the Supreme Court. And you have to ensure that you file it within a very short time period, a month time period, because it's restricted, time barred by the Constitution. As regards right to movement, I think it can be restricted in a situation like this because it is allowed under the quarantining related laws. If it is only being done to certain groups of people, then you can obviously show that there is no equality in the way that the law is handled. Then you could probably raise a claim about the equality issue there. But apart from that, unless of course you're prevented when you have a pass to go, because sometimes there are issues like that when you held the curfew pass also, if you're prevented from going, then that is of course an issue that you can raise in the Supreme Court.
So ma'am, this meeting is
time,
in another 2 minutes. Yeah. And the link for the next meeting is in the group chat. So if please join from that, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience.
No worries, we'll join again.